Hello, everybody. I guess the first thing to say is on Learn, I've put up a notice about the final examination. And so you should look at that. It basically explains that the exam will be, it'll be a take home. I'll put it up on the 19th of April at 12 o'clock, and it will be due back on the 26th. It will consist of 3 parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you are responsible. So there are questions that are going to be drawn. The first part obviously is going to be drawn from the first part of the course. So you need to know all 38 questions. And I'll be taking 3 from each part of the course. Is there anything that people don't understand?
Yeah, sorry, Professor. I have a quick question. You said 3 from each part of the course. Would that be 9 questions total?
No, sorry, I didn't make that clear. No, 1 question. So
Okay.
it's 3 questions in total, 1 from each part.
Okay.
Right, 9 questions, 9 answers.
Woo! Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that's it. Anything else? Okay. So the next, somebody cried out with a whoop. That's good. Don't obliterate the course with whoops, but a certain enthusiasm is good. 26 is the review question for today. How true is it to suggest that the Romans became in giving birth to the empire, the Roman Republic destroyed itself? Well, as explained in my lectures, the Roman Republic, it was a self-governing state, but within that state there were 2 parties, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians dominated the Senate and the councils, and the people, the plebeians, they had tribunes who could appear before the Senate and argue the case of the people. They had their popular assemblies. But the truth is that really from almost the beginning, there was continuous class conflict between these 2 groups. And as I explained, in terms of mitigating this conflict, the whole issue was land and rents and so on. The Roman Republic began to expand, began to conquer. And ultimately, this led to the development of the empire. Now, the legions, which were the basic military instrument of the Republic, were made up of officers from the patrician class, but the rank and file were conscripted peasants who had to serve in the army. And so the mass of the army was made up of these peasants. And what we find is that essentially the peasantry were destroyed over time because they were required to serve in the war for such a long time. And in particular, the Punic Wars, especially the War of 221, the Second Punic War, basically saw the invasion of Italy by the Carthaginians, and really during this period, many farms were destroyed. The peasants fell into debt, and you see they more and more of them lost their land, and this process continued right to the end of the Republic. So essentially the landowning peasants, who were the basis of allegiance in the early phase of the Republic, gradually disappeared during the 2nd and 1st century BC. Meanwhile, there had been attempts to democratize the Constitution. For example, in 287, the plebeians forced the Republic to recognize that the popular assembly, in theory, was the dominant part of the Constitution. They even, in 266, got the Senate to agree that one of the councils should be a plebeian. And very important, toward the end of the Republic, was the rise of the Gracchi brothers. During the 130s and 120s BC, the Gracchi tried really to change the Constitution and to institute both land reform and a more democratic constitution. And of course, they were killed. And that really was the end, in a certain way, of most of the class conflict in the Republic. The patrician class now dominated. And indeed, the constant expansion of the empire, the constant imperialism in itself tended to strengthen the hand of the politicians who sat in the Senate at the expense of the popular assembly. The popular assembly, for various reasons, but basically the people had to work, and so it was, and especially as the empire expanded, it became untenable as an instrument of government. So the popular assembly, especially after the death of the Gracchi, tended to become increasingly meaningless. Meanwhile, in terms of the imperialism itself, the constant conquest of new territory during the 2nd and 1st century BC required a larger and larger army. And they had to, the state had to open the army up to other Italians, indeed non-Italians, and certainly by the 1st century BC, there was a split between the civil government, the Republican government, and the increasingly professional army, which was made up no longer of peasant citizens, but basically of mercenaries, people who joined the army in order to survive. And these people had no stake in the politics of the Republic. They followed their generals, the generals of the legions. So we saw in the last century of the Republic a rise of a series of general politicians, the first of whom was Marius during the last, the Punic War and the Numidian War. Then there was Sully, then there was Pompey, and then there was Caesar. People who curried favor, developed a faction, including elements of the populace, because of their conquests overseas and the distribution of gold and other booty. And therefore, the institutions of the Republic basically became less and less relevant, and the army more relevant, and ultimately the Constitution was finally undermined, I guess you could say, ultimately by Julius Caesar. So that's basically the story. Any questions about this account? Okay. I should say that on the exam, you can draw on other sources, but I'm particularly interested in the the lectures. The reviews that I conduct during the lectures should be the basis of an answer. You can use other sources, but I want to see that you've paid attention to these reviews that I've been giving you. Are there any questions now about what I've said? Okay, good. Now, today I'm going to start off looking at the development of Christianity just for a bit. And I want to turn for the most of the lecture to the development of what we call the Carolingian Empire. There was, at the end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century, in effect, a kind of revival of the Roman Empire. In the reign of Charlemagne, as I say, toward the end of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century, a revival of the so-called revival of the Roman Empire took place in the West. There was, of course, the Eastern Roman Empire, which I've mentioned, but now in the West, under this great leader, Charlemagne, leader of the Franks, he became essentially emperor, and he created what came to be, well, from the very beginning, its name was the Holy Roman Empire. It was the Roman Empire, all right, but it had a new name, Holy Roman Empire, because of course this was a Christian empire. It was a Christian empire, and this is very important in terms of the sort of crystallization of Western civilization. This creation of this empire, although it proved in the short run to be ephemeral, nevertheless, it tied together most, if not all, of the states of what became Western civilization. And it was the complement, if you like, of the Roman Catholic Church. The two became twin institutions. And so the integration of what we call Western Europe in a political sense occurs for the first time under this great king, Charlemagne, which translates into English as Charles the Great, Charlemagne. In French, Magnus, which means great. So Charles the Great was his name, Charlemagne. So I want to talk about this for the most of the hour. But I want to start, we left off talking about monasticism, and I want to go back to that because I didn't quite elaborate enough about its importance. We saw that monasticism originated in Egypt as hermetism, these hermits going out into the desert. But eventually in the 4th century, you have first this character Pachomius and then Saint Basil, who tried to create basically organized hermetism or monasticism. And they set up certain rules in these communities, try to curb the individualism, which is sort of what these hermits were all about. Well, eventually, monasticism reached the West, and in central Italy, about here, at a place called Monte Cassino, Benedict, or Saint Benedict of Nursia, as he came to be called, he created a monastery. And this monastery created by Benedict of Nursia, this of course was the site of a great siege during the Second World War. The monastery was virtually destroyed. The Germans occupied the monastery and the Americans and the Canadians besieged it, and it was destroyed. Well, the big thing about Benedict was he instituted this rule based on, as I explained, poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty in the sense that the Benedictines could control no personal property. Chastity, because monks took a vow of chastity. This ultimately spread to the secular clergy in the Roman Catholic Church round about the 11th century. And the last element was obedience, and obedience was most important. That is to say, you had to give up personal sort of arrogance. You had to give up your ego, if you like, and you had to obey, above all, the head of the monastery, the abbot. You had to break your sort of personal will and surrender to the rules of the monastery. And some historians argue that this notion of obedience actually goes back to Rome, that is to say, especially the Roman legions. And the whole notion of obedience was very important in the Roman state and in its heyday. And so they link this notion of obedience. But of course, we saw that the early monks tended to be unruly. So this underlining obedience was quite important. Now, a second important element of the Benedictines, as they came to be called after Saint Benedict, was that as part of the routine of the monastery, all the monks had to work. All the monks had to spend a certain amount of time, aside from their prayers, their meditations, they had to do a certain amount of work. It sort of provided it was part of the discipline. And usually the work that they did, most of these monks, who mainly almost overwhelmingly came from the better off people. The monasteries in general, they recruited, for the most part, I will qualify this a little bit, but generally speaking, we're talking about people who are better off. In any case, in terms of work, basically they went into the library and they copied manuscripts for several hours during the day as a kind of exercise. This, of course, scholars point out that sometimes the monks didn't really understand what they were copying, but they were copying Cicero or Aristotle or Seneca, some of these thinkers from the ancient Latin or even Greek world. And these manuscripts accumulated in the monasteries, and they're important because when modern times began, the first thing that sort of the world of modern culture was interested in was what did the ancients think, and how can we find out about the ancients? Well, basically, they discovered the manuscripts of the ancient world that were lying in these libraries. So the Benedictines provided an enormous service to Western civilization. Now, beyond this, it's important to say that the Benedictines, what they said was they did not dismiss the idea that working in the garden or working in the fields was to be despised, to be dismissed. In fact, one of their sayings was that work was a form of prayer. They said that doing work, and we can have some sense of this, and some people take pleasure in gardening today and so on. There's a certain peace and communion with nature that goes with field work or garden work. And the Benedictines appreciated this. And so they said, work is a form of prayer. The Latin expression is laborare, which means work, et orare. Work is prayer, was the saying. Now, why is this so important? Well, if you look back at the ancient world, or you look at medieval times, indeed, you could look all the way down to the French Revolution. The upper classes in antiquity, during the Middle Ages, and even in early modern times, they despised work, manual work of any type. Manual work identified you immediately as a peasant or a mere craftsman. And good people, people of gentility, did not work with their hands. And this, of course, this kind of work was identified with, in antiquity in particular, with slavery or being a member of the peasantry. The same thing goes in the medieval period. But the Benedictines had a different view. And ultimately, it did affect attitudes, especially, I would say, from the 15th, 16th century onwards. With the sort of emergence of middle classes, they picked up on this and they began to say, you know, work is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. We don't care what the upper class thinks of us. We think differently. And of course, in terms of modern times, economic development, such a change of attitude is quite important. Now, the last thing I would say is that the Benedictines, their monasteries, of which there were hundreds and thousands, several thousands, let's put it that way, across the face of Europe by, say, the 11th or 12th century. They started out more or less humbly, but over the generations, especially as more and more property and gifts were given to them, the Benedictines became extremely rich. They were the richest monks. There were other groups of monastics later on, but the Benedictines were absolutely the richest. And some of these monasteries are incredibly, they're palaces. And attached to the monastery would be huge amounts of land. And a lot of this land was certainly, some of it was worked by peasants, but they they gradually allowed what they called servant brothers. In other words, the core monks worked in the library, but out in the fields there were what was called servant brothers, and these essentially were from the lower classes, who basically helped out with the heavy lifting, with the heavy labor. This is the setup. So that I would conclude that the Benedictine monasteries were, all in all, centers of, in a period of violence, anarchy, illiteracy, and so on, these were beacons of light during the Dark Ages. And as I think I mentioned, both the popes and the secular governments, in addition to drawing on the capabilities of the bishops, and I mentioned how important the bishops were, they were political figures. Likewise, the abbots in the monasteries played a similar role. They were administrators. They would be called upon by the kings to help them or to advise them. And so they played this role during these years in particular, the Dark Ages, and even in the 11th and 12th centuries. The last thing I want to mention is that the Benedictines were also important missionaries. They they helped to convert the pagan barbarian kingdoms, of which Western Europe was made up. And I pointed out that England was converted to Catholicism by St. Augustine. At the beginning of the 6th century, he was sent by Gregory the Great, and he was a Benedictine monk who basically got the rulers to convert to the Roman Catholic religion. Likewise, Boniface, later Saint Boniface, began the conversion of the Germans across the Rhine River from Gaul to Catholicism. So the monasteries, centers of civilization, centers of this new and powerful religion. At the same time, I want to say finally that Christianity, as it had evolved by the 8th century, was very different from the Christianity of the original Christianity, or the Christianity of the 2nd century, because in the first place, it was mixed up, as we've already seen, with elements of religion of the Greeks and of the Romans, but now in Western Europe, also the barbarians, elements of the barbarian belief became mixed up with the foundational teachings of Christianity. So you have, for example, the development of the worship of the saints, these elaborate rituals, which some of which stem back to some of the religions that existed under the Romans. The calendar, the feast days and the holy days of the calendar, the days celebrated as holidays or saints' days, many of them, if you look back at them, they are taken over and are essentially, they are adaptations of pagan practices. And of course, I already mentioned earlier in term the cult of Mary, the cult of the Virgin, Our Lady, Notre Dame. Well, as I explained, this Our Lady goes back to um, the Paleolithic period. The mother goddesses begin to appear already in the Paleolithic period. They take new form in the Neolithic period. We saw the Egyptians, some of their main deities were goddesses. Um, there was the mother goddess, Ishtar. There was the mother goddess uh, of the Roman period. And this becomes, um, it becomes part of Christianity, is what I'm saying. Mothers are worshipped. They're important. Motherhood is very important, and it has religious meaning. Um, so I would say make a last point about this. When many centuries later, at the beginning of the 16th century, the Europeans discovered the New World. 1492, Columbus, and all that. We may even get there in this course. I'm not sure. Well, and they found the new continent, particularly Latin America, Central America, and South America. Well, the accompanying the explorers, the discoverers were, of course, missionaries whose purpose was basically to convert the so-called pagan religion, the pagan people of Latin America, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Maya, to Catholicism. They were specifically instructed to basically include or allow some of the practices of these pagans, just as they allowed the Germans, who were being converted way back in the 7th and 8th century, to retain certain elements of their pagan worship, sort of adapt them. This specific instructions, for example, the letters of Gregory the Great lay this out. The same thing was done with Latin America, and you have in Latin America kind of specific kind of Roman Catholicism that stems from this attitude. It facilitated the acceptance of the Roman Catholic religion. So that basically concludes what I had to say. I now want to talk about the rise of the Carolingian Empire. Here you see the Carolingian, and maybe I could show once again the map. Carolingian refers to, Carol is the sort of Latin name for Charles, Charlemagne, so Carolingian. Carolingian, the empire of Charlemagne, is referred to also as the Carolingian Empire. So how did it begin? Well, let's begin with the fact that if you look at the state of Western Europe at the beginning of the 8th century, we're in the middle of the Dark Ages, we could say that things seem to be going from bad to worse. I'm talking about 710, 720, 730, and so on. Things do not look good in terms of violence, anarchy, absence of both real economic life and political life. For example, in Italy, at this period, the beginning of the 8th century, certainly the popes are there in Rome, but in the north, and the Byzantines are present in the south of Italy. The Byzantines, remember, I said in the 6th century they came back and they controlled the south, but the north was taken over by the Lombards. I mentioned this earlier. So this new wave of barbarism. In Spain, remember that the Visigoths occupied Spain at the beginning of the 5th century. They were Arians. Well, by the beginning of the 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom was at its last legs. They didn't get the Visigoths didn't get along with the old Hispanic Roman aristocracy. There were religious differences, although the Visigoths ultimately were forced to become Catholics, and they had different laws. Well, all of this was swept away in 710 because they were invaded by the Arabs, and the Arabs obliterated the Visigothic kingdom in 710 and established basically an Islamic state in Spain. So the Lombards, the now Islamic State in Spain. If you look at England, it's true that the Anglo-Saxons basically took over from the Celts. You probably know that the Celts remain in the British Isles, in Wales, in Ireland, and in Scotland. But the rest, and I would say the richest part of the British Isles, was taken by the Anglo-Saxons toward the end of the 5th century. So, and there were a lot of them. But the thing is that still there was a huge anarchy in England because there were 7 rival small kingdoms, small Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. There was no political unity. Furthermore, if we look at Gaul, France, it had been taken by especially the north, but the whole of basically what is now France was occupied by the Franks at the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. And you second. The great figure there in terms of this conquest is their king, the king of the Franks, at the end of the 5th, beginning of the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century. His name was Clovis. Clovis, king of the Franks, and the dynasty that he founded was called the Merovingian dynasty. And Clovis, he did convert to Roman Catholicism, which helped him a lot. Furthermore, in subsequent years, the Merovingians, who of course originated in Germany, they occupied a significant part of West Germany as part of the Merovingian kingdom. It was not only confined to what is now called France, but they took over a large part of what we call West Germany. But by the time we arrive at the 8th century, beginning of the 8th century, this Merovingian dynasty was largely exhausted. And furthermore, of course, we're in the middle of the Dark Ages. The Merovingian kings had no money, there were no merchants, there was no trade, there was little basis for a strong central government. So the aristocrats were basically running wild. This was what we call feudal anarchy is rife. The kings are very weak. And the last point to be made is that basically trade across the Mediterranean is blocked by the Arabs. They occupy North Africa, the Middle East, and even Spain. And there's little or no commerce on the Mediterranean. And indeed, the Muslims, the Arabs, are raiding with their ships. They're raiding the south of France, the Italian coast, and of course, they've taken over in Spain. So I would say that at the beginning of the 8th century, things look bleak. However, toward the end of the 8th century, a new power begins to emerge, focus of power. And the focus of power, this is the Rhine River here, and it basically is the point of separation between, sorry, it's here, the point of separation between Germany and France today, the Rhine River. Well, on both sides of the Rhine River, of course, the Franks were in occupation. This was the Frankish kingdom. But in particular, there was one family, the Carolingian family, who had lands both in France and Germany, especially in the region, the very wealthy region we now call Alsace and Lorraine. This was the heartland of the Carolingians. And they began to accumulate power in the 8th century. And indeed, they got so much power, they became servants of the last of the Merovingian kings. They basically were the prime ministers, or as we call them, mayors of the palace, prime minister, mayors of the palace. Indicated here. In any case, the kings were largely impotent, and it was these ministers, these mayors of the palace, this family, Carolingian family, that began to emerge as the real power. And the first important one of them was named Charles Martel. Martel means hammer. His name was Charles the Hammerer. And why was that? Well, because he organized the armies, basically now armies of feudal knights on horseback with swords, lances, etc., recognizable as the knights of the Middle Ages. As by the 8th century, cavalry, this kind of feudal cavalry with armor, has begun to emerge. Well, he leads the feudal host, all of the landed aristocracy now organized as an army against an Arab invasion of France. You'll remember that France was conquered by the Arabs in 710. Well, in 731, they crossed the Pyrenees and they basically tried to overrun France. And it is Charles Martel at the Battle of Poitiers in southern France who defeats the advancing army. They were overextended and they lost the battle, beating a retreat. But this gave the Carolingians enormous prestige. Secondly, Martel was quite important in sponsoring the activities of St. Boniface in Western Germany and in Central Germany in converting the pagan Germans to Christianity. So he was a good Christian. The next important figure in this rise of the Carolingians was, again, notice his name was Pepin the Short, and I don't think I need to explain that. It turned out that he was a formidable politician and warrior. And in terms of politics, he was the one who basically convinced the German nobility to basically get rid of the last of the Merovingians and to acclaim him and the Carolingian family as the kings of France. So he displaces the Merovingians, and now the Carolingians have ascended to the royal throne. And 3 years later, his diplomats convinced the Pope to recognize that indeed Pepin the Short is the legitimate king of France. So this is all quite important, but Pepin returns the favor to the popes because remember I said that the papacy was threatened by the Lombards in the north. Well, in 756, Pepin crosses the Alps with a feudal army, and he subdues the Lombards. He basically destroys Lombard power, and he gives this, he doesn't give all of northern Italy, but he gives a large part of it to the Pope as a gift for recognizing that he is king of France. So the papal state, which has been in formation since the time of Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, now after 756, there's a town with beautiful mosaics called Ravenna near Venice. That becomes the northern frontier of the papal state. The papal state is a veritable state now, and it remains a papal state of these dimensions until the unification of Italy in 1859. The popes are spiritual leaders, no doubt about it, but they have a state. This is extremely important. So this is the accomplishment of Pepin the Short. Sometimes little guys have huge ambitions. Think of Napoleon and so on. And so at last, we come to the reign of Charlemagne himself, which overshadowed that of his father and that of his grandfather. Charlemagne, who reigns from 768 to 814. A reign of essentially 46 years, nearly 50 years, half a century. And during this period, basically what he does is he conquers most of Western Europe. This was originally the kingdom of the Franks. He basically takes over most of Western Europe, reorganizes it, and gets himself acclaimed Holy Roman Emperor. He does this without the permission of the emperor in Constantinople. He just does it. As a matter of fact, although the Pope encouraged this step by Charlemagne, Charlemagne doesn't accept the crown from the Pope. He crowns himself as if to signify, my power doesn't come from you. It comes directly from God. And so this step on the part of Charlemagne, what does it mean? It means that the political integration of all of Western Europe for the first time as a single entity. The popes, in a way, the Roman Catholic Church, have already unified Europe as a religious entity, as a Roman Catholic entity. But now Charlemagne takes this a step further and basically, and certainly using Roman Catholicism, but also his own political and military strength, he creates a veritable Holy Roman Empire, politically integrating. And now this is really the birth of Western civilization, as we will see in the next class. Have a good day.